In the dim glow of a flickering lantern, deep in the Missouri Ozarks in 1957, a young boy named Elias Carver sat motionless in his family's ramshackle cabin, his unblinking eyes fixed on a tattered notebook, his pencil scratched furiously, filling page after page with cryptic symbols, numbers, and names. Names of people who would soon be dead. 13 of them, to be exact. The first was a neighbor, found lifeless in a creek the next morning, her face frozen in a scream no one heard. Elias, only 12 years old and mute since birth, had written her name the night before, alongside the exact time and place of her death. Coincidence? That's what the townsfolk whispered at first. But as the bodies piled up, each death matching Elias's eerie predictions with chilling precision, the whispers turned to screams of their own. Fear gripped the small town of Black Hollow, and one question burned in every heart. How could a silent, autistic boy know the future? And why did death follow his every word? This is no ordinary tale of crime or madness. This is the story of Elias Carver, a boy whose mind seemed to peer into the shadows of fate, unraveling secrets no human should know. Was he a prophet, a monster, or something far worse? Each revelation in this case pulls you deeper into a labyrinth of dread, where the line between genius and horror blurs, and the truth is more unsettling than you can imagine. What drove Elias to predict those 13 deaths? Was he merely observing the future, or was he orchestrating it? And what was the final unspeakable secret he carried to his grave? A secret that still haunts Black Hollow to this day. This case forces us to confront the fragility of the human mind, the terror of the unknown, and the chilling possibility that some truths are better left buried. It's a story that will cling to you, make you question how much control we truly have over our fates and whether evil can hide in the quietest of souls. Stay with us until the end, because the answers to these questions will unravel a mystery that could change how you see the world forever. If you're ready to dive into this dark journey, hit that like button to help others uncover the chilling truth behind Elias Carver's story. In the comments, leave the phrase, "I'm ready to discover the truth about this story." By doing so, you're joining a community of truth seekers who dare to face the shadows of the human psyche. Thank you for being here, for having the courage to explore what most would flee from. Prepare yourself, because what comes next contains a key revelation that will forever change the way you see the human mind. The air in Black Hollow, Missouri, was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth on that chilly October evening in 1957. The small Ozark town, nestled in a valley where the sun seemed to linger just a little too briefly, was quiet, too quiet, some would later say. Elias Carver, a lanky boy with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to see beyond the horizon, sat on the warped porch of his family's cabin, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. His mother, Ruth, a weary woman with calloused hands and a heart heavy with unspoken fears, watched him from the kitchen window. She'd always known Elias was different. Born mute, diagnosed with autism at a time when the word was barely understood, he communicated through gestures and those endless pages of scribbles no one could decipher. But that night something was different. Elias wasn't just writing, he was trembling, his pencil moving as if guided by an unseen force. Inside the notebook, in a script so precise it looked almost mechanical, Elias had written a single name, Margaret Hale. Below it, the words creek, midnight, drowned. The clock on the mantel ticked closer to 11, and Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She didn't know why she felt compelled to check on Margaret, the kind widow who lived a half-mile down the dirt path. But something in Elias's unblinking stare urged her to act. She grabbed her shawl and lantern and hurried out, her breath catching as she stumbled through the dark. The creek was swollen from recent rains, its waters rushing with a low, menacing roar. When Ruth reached the bank, her lantern illuminated a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Margaret's body, tangled in the roots of a willow, her face pale and twisted in terror, her hands clutching at nothing. The town doctor later confirmed she'd drowned just after midnight, exactly as Elias's notebook had foretold. Word of the tragedy spread through Black Hollow like wildfire. By morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the Carver cabin, their whispers sharp with suspicion. Margaret had been well-liked, a churchgoer who baked pies for the town fair and tended to sick neighbors. Her death was no accident, they murmured. Someone had pushed her, or worse. But how could a 12-year-old boy who never spoke and rarely left his porch know such a thing? Ruth, clutching Elias protectively, insisted it was a coincidence. "He's just a boy," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He don't mean no harm." But the townsfolk noticed the way Elias's eyes darted, as if seeing something they couldn't, and their unease grew. Sheriff Amos Reed, a gruff man with a penchant for quick judgments, took the notebook into evidence, flipping through pages of incomprehensible symbols and numbers. "This ain't normal," he muttered, his brow furrowing as he read Margaret's name again. The preacher, Reverend Holt, was the first to call it a sign. Standing on the steps of the clapboard church, he declared Elias's prediction a warning from God, or perhaps something darker. "The boy sees what we cannot," he intoned, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But is it a gift or a curse?" Some nodded, their fear tinged with awe. Others crossed themselves, backing away from the Carver name as if it carried a plague. Elias, oblivious to the growing storm, sat silently, his pencil moving again. That night he wrote another name, Thomas Granger. Below it, barn, dawn, hanged. Thomas, a local farmer known for his temper and heavy drinking, was found at sunrise, swinging from a rafter in his own barn, a rope knotted tightly around his neck. The coroner ruled it a suicide, but the town saw Elias's hand in it. 2 deaths, 2 predictions, both exact. The whispers turned to accusations. Was Elias somehow causing these deaths? Or was he merely a vessel for some malevolent force? Ruth, now terrified of her own son, hid the notebook, but Elias found scraps of paper, even writing on the walls when desperate. Each time a new name appeared, and with it another death loomed. The town's fear began to fracture its fragile bonds. Neighbors stopped speaking, doors were locked at dusk, and parents kept their children far from the Carver cabin. Yet Elias seemed unaffected, his focus solely on his writing, as if compelled by a force greater than himself. Ruth, torn between love for her son and dread of what he might be, began to notice patterns in his behavior. The way he'd stare at the sky before writing, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The way his hands shook when a name appeared, as if fighting against the act. She confided in Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a psychiatrist from St. Louis who'd visited Black Hollow to study rural mental health. Dr. Marsh, intrigued by Elias's case, agreed to meet him, unaware that her involvement would plunge her into a mystery that defied science. As the days passed, Elias's predictions grew more frequent, each one more chilling than the last. The town's panic swelled, and with it a dangerous question. If Elias could see death coming, could he also stop it? Or was he, as some began to believe, the architect of Black Hollow's nightmare? The answer lay hidden in the pages of his notebook, but no one, not Ruth, not the sheriff, not even Dr. Marsh, was prepared for what they would find there. Dr. Evelyn Marsh arrived in Black Hollow on a gray November morning in 1957, her suitcase heavy with textbooks and her mind alight with curiosity. A psychiatrist in her early 30s, she had a reputation for tackling cases that blurred the line between science and the inexplicable. The Ozarks were a far cry from her St. Louis office, but the rumors of Elias Carver, a mute boy predicting deaths with uncanny precision, had reached her through a colleague's letter. She saw it as a chance to study a rare mind, perhaps even publish a groundbreaking paper. What she found instead was a town teetering on the edge of hysteria, and a boy whose silence held secrets that chilled her to the core. Elias sat at the kitchen table in the Carver cabin, his thin frame hunched over a new scrap of paper, his pencil tracing patterns that seemed to dance between chaos and order. Ruth, his mother, hovered nearby, her hands wringing a dishcloth as she recounted the events of the past weeks. Margaret Hale's drowning, Thomas Granger's hanging, and the growing list of names in Elias's notebook. "He don't talk, Dr. Marsh," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he knows things he shouldn't." Evelyn, trained to see symptoms where others saw omens, observed Elias closely. His eyes, a pale gray that seemed to reflect the dim light, flicked toward her briefly before returning to his work. She noticed his hands, steady yet trembling, as if caught in a struggle between compulsion and resistance. Evelyn asked to see the notebook Sheriff Reed had confiscated, now kept under lock and key at the station. The sheriff, his face etched with suspicion, handed it over reluctantly. "This ain't just a boy's scribbles," he warned. "There's something wrong with him, Doc. Something unnatural." The pages were a labyrinth of symbols, spirals, grids and numbers that seemed to follow no logical pattern, interspersed with names and details of deaths. Margaret's entry was there, as was Thomas's, but so were others. 11 more to be exact, some yet to occur. The third name, written in Elias's meticulous script, was Clara Boone. Field. Noon. Crushed. Evelyn's scientific mind raced for explanations. Precognition? Coincidence, or perhaps a savant-like ability to process patterns others missed. But the specificity, the exact times, places, and methods defied her training. That same day at precisely noon, Clara Boone, a schoolteacher who dismissed the town's fears as superstition, was found dead in a fallow field. A tractor left idling by a farmhand had rolled over her, its wheels leaving a grim imprint on the earth. The coroner confirmed the time of death matched Elias's prediction to the minute. Evelyn, present at the scene as a consultant, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She returned to the Carver cabin, determined to speak with Elias, but found him in a trance-like state, writing yet another name. Jacob Wells. Road. Dusk. Struck. Ruth, now pale and shaking, begged Evelyn to take Elias away. "He's cursed, ain't he?" she whispered. "Or we all are." Evelyn refused to believe in curses, but she couldn't ignore the pattern. She began sessions with Elias sitting across from him in the cramped cabin, her notepad filling with observations. He never spoke, but his eyes seemed to communicate a depth of awareness that unnerved her. She tried basic tests, drawing exercises, puzzles, even music to gauge his cognitive abilities. Elias responded with astonishing speed, solving complex mathematical sequences and recreating melodies after a single listen. Yet his focus always returned to his writing, as if it were a compulsion he couldn't escape. Evelyn hypothesized that his autism amplified his perception, perhaps allowing him to detect subtle cues, weather patterns, human behavior, that predicted accidents. But the deaths were too precise, too varied to be mere accidents. As dusk approached, the town braced for Jacob Wells' fate. Jacob, a local mechanic, scoffed at the warnings, refusing to stay indoors. "I ain't afraid of no kid's scribbles," he declared, climbing into his truck. At exactly 5:47 p.m., as the sun dipped below the hills, a delivery van swerved on the narrow road outside Black Hollow, striking Jacob as he walked home. He died instantly, his body crumpled by the roadside. The driver, shaken but unharmed, swore he'd seen a shadow dart across the road, though no one else was found. Elias's notebook, now back in his hands, lay open to Jacob's name, the ink still wet. Evelyn's skepticism began to crack. She spent nights poring over Elias's symbols, searching for a code, a pattern, anything to explain his predictions. She noticed recurring motifs, spirals that seemed to mimic celestial alignments, numbers that aligned with dates and times of death. She consulted an astronomer friend, who suggested the symbols might correspond to star positions, but the connection was tenuous. Meanwhile, the town's fear turned to rage. A group of men led by Reverend Holt demanded Elias be locked away. "He's no boy," Holt thundered at a town meeting. "He's a harbinger of death." Ruth, torn between protecting her son and fearing him, allowed Evelyn to take Elias to a makeshift clinic for observation, hoping science could save him. In the clinic, Elias's behavior grew stranger. He refused to sleep, writing through the night, his pages filling with names and details of deaths yet to come. Evelyn, sleepless herself, felt the weight of Black Hollow's terror pressing in. She began to dream of Elias's symbols, their shapes twisting into nightmares of blood and shadow. Each morning she woke to news of another death, each matching Elias's predictions. The town was unraveling, and Evelyn was no closer to understanding the boy who seemed to hold its fate in his silent hands. As the fifth name appeared in his notebook, she realized the truth might lie not in science, but in the darkness Elias seemed to see so clearly. By mid-November 1957, Black Hollow was a town under siege, not by an external enemy, but by the creeping dread that had taken root in its heart. The Missouri Ozarks, once a haven of quiet routines and neighborly trust, now buzzed with paranoia. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and the once lively town square stood empty, its cobblestones slick with frost and fear. Elias Carver, the mute 12-year-old whose predictions had claimed 4 lives, Margaret Hale, Thomas Granger, Clara Boone, and Jacob Wells, sat in Dr. Evelyn Marsh's makeshift clinic, his pencil moving relentlessly across scraps of paper. Each stroke seemed to tighten the noose around Black Hollow's collective psyche, and the townsfolk were no longer whispering. They were shouting, demanding answers, action, and for some, vengeance. Dr. Marsh, her eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, watched Elias through a haze of exhaustion and unease. The clinic, a converted storage room in the town hall, smelled of antiseptic and mildew, its walls papered with charts of Elias's cryptic symbols. She'd taped his latest pages to the wall, a mosaic of spirals, numbers, and names that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The fifth name, written the previous night, was Lillian Porter, Church, Midnight, Fire. Evelyn had tried to warn Lillian, a devout seamstress who spent her evenings praying at the clapboard church, but the woman dismissed her with a wave. God protects his own, Lillian said, her voice firm with faith. Evelyn, torn between her scientific skepticism and the mounting evidence of Elias's accuracy, stationed herself outside the church that night, her breath visible in the frigid air. At 11:55 p.m., a faint glow flickered through the church's stained glass windows. By midnight, flames erupted, licking the wooden beams with a ferocity that seemed almost deliberate. Lillian's screams pierced the night as the townsfolk rushed to the scene, buckets in hand, but the fire was too fierce. The church collapsed in a roar of sparks and timber, and Lillian's charred remains were found in the ashes, clutching a rosary. The coroner later confirmed the fire started from a candle Lillian had left burning, but the townsfolk saw Elias's hand in it. He knew, they muttered, their voices thick with accusation. He always knows. The town hall meeting that followed was chaos. Reverend Holt, his face flushed with righteous fury, stood on a crate, brandishing Elias's notebook like a weapon. "This boy is no prophet," he roared. "He's a devil's pawn marking souls for death." The crowd, a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and mothers clutching their children, erupted in agreement. Sheriff Amos Reed, struggling to maintain order, admitted he was out of his depth. "We can't lock up a child for writing," he said, but his words were drowned by shouts. Some called for Elias to be sent to an asylum. Others, emboldened by fear, hinted at darker solutions. Ruth Carver, standing at the back, wept silently, her love for her son warring with the terror of what he might be. Evelyn, called to speak, tried to calm the crowd with reason. Elias's condition, his autism, may give him an extraordinary ability to process patterns, she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "He's not causing these deaths. He's predicting them, perhaps seeing connections we can't." But her words fell flat. The townsfolk didn't want theories, they wanted safety. A farmer named Henry Tate, whose brother had been Jacob Wells, stood up, his face twisted with grief. "If he's so smart, why don't he stop it? Why is he just writing names like some grim reaper?" The question hung in the air unanswered, as Evelyn realized she had no explanation that could satisfy them. That night, Elias wrote another name, Samuel Klein, River Dawn, stabbed. Samuel, a reclusive fisherman, was found at first light, his body floating in the shallows of the Black River, a knife wound in his chest. The blade, a rusted fishing knife, was one he'd owned for years, but no one could explain how it ended up in his heart. The town's fear tipped into madness. A group of men, led by Henry Tate, stormed the clinic, demanding Elias be handed over. Evelyn barred the door, her heart pounding, while Ruth cradled Elias, who seemed oblivious, his pencil still moving. Sheriff Reed arrived just in time, dispersing the mob with threats of arrest, but the tension was a lit fuse ready to ignite. Evelyn, now desperate, began to question her own assumptions. She'd dismissed the supernatural, but the precision of Elias's predictions, down to the minute, the method, the place, challenged every theory she'd studied. She noticed something new in his latest pages, a recurring symbol, a jagged spiral that appeared before each name. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost like a signature. She cross-referenced it with his earlier writings and found it had appeared before every death, growing larger, more intricate. Was it a code? A warning, or as Reverend Holt might claim, a mark of something unholy? As the sixth death loomed, Evelyn decided to test Elias's predictions. She planned to shadow Samuel Klein's predicted successor, hoping to prevent the next tragedy. But Elias's behavior grew erratic. He began rocking back and forth, his eyes darting to the ceiling as if seeing something beyond the clinic's walls. Late that night, he seized a piece of chalk and scrawled the spiral symbol across the floor, larger than ever, its lines jagged and urgent. Evelyn, watching, felt a chill that wasn't just the November cold. She realized that understanding Elias's mind might mean confronting a truth she wasn't ready to face, a truth that could unravel not just Black Hollow, but her own sanity. The frost-laden air of late November 1957 clung to Black Hollow like a shroud, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her face gaunt from sleepless nights, paced the cramped clinic where Elias Carver sat, his thin fingers clutching a pencil that never seemed to rest. The walls, now a chaotic collage of his cryptic symbols, seemed to pulse with an unspoken warning. The jagged spiral, larger and more intricate with each death, loomed over every page, its presence a silent scream in the dim light. 5 deaths, Margaret Hale, Thomas Granger, Clara Boone, Jacob Wells, and Samuel Klein, had torn Black Hollow apart, each one foretold by Elias's unerring hand. The 6th name, freshly inked in his notebook, was Mary Tate, Forest Midnight, fallen. Mary, the soft-spoken wife of Henry Tate, the farmer who'd led the mob against Elias, was now the next in line. Evelyn, driven by a desperate need to break the cycle, resolved to stop this death. She couldn't accept that Elias's predictions were inevitable. There had to be a way to intervene to prove that fate could be defied. She shared her plan with Sheriff Amos Reed, who, though skeptical, agreed to help. "If we save Mary, maybe the town will calm down," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. Ruth Carver, Elias's mother, was less hopeful. "You can't stop what's written," she whispered, her eyes hollow as she watched her son, who rocked gently, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. Evelyn ignored the warning, clinging to her belief that science could unravel the mystery. She didn't yet realize how far she was from the truth. Mary Tate, a nervous woman with a habit of wringing her hands, agreed to Evelyn's protection, though her trust was fragile. "Henry says it's the boy's fault," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to die." Evelyn arranged for Mary to stay in the clinic under constant watch, reasoning that keeping her away from the forest would break the prediction's hold. Sheriff Reed stationed a deputy outside, and Evelyn herself sat vigil, her eyes darting between Mary's anxious fidgeting and Elias's relentless writing. The boy seemed unaware of the tension, his pencil tracing the same spiral symbol, now so large it spilled across multiple pages. Evelyn tried to engage him, asking him to draw something else, anything else, but he ignored her, his focus absolute. As midnight approached, the clinic grew oppressively still. Mary, clutching a blanket, whispered prayers, her eyes darting to the windows. Evelyn checked her watch, 11:58 p.m. The deputy outside reported nothing unusual, but the air felt charged, as if the night itself were waiting. Then a crash shattered the silence. A window in the back room, left unsecured, had been blown open by a sudden gust. Mary screamed, bolting toward the door in panic. Evelyn lunged to stop her, but Mary, driven by blind fear, slipped past the deputy and ran into the night, straight toward the dense forest that bordered the town. Evelyn and the deputy gave chase, their flashlights cutting through the dark as branches clawed at their faces. They found Mary at the edge of a ravine, her foot caught in a tangle of roots. She was sobbing, incoherent, as she tried to free herself. "It's him!" she cried. "He's calling me!" Before Evelyn could reach her, the earth gave way, and Mary fell, her body tumbling down the rocky slope. When they reached her, she was still, her neck broken, her eyes wide with terror. The time was 12:03 a.m. The forest, as Elias had written, had claimed her. The failure crushed Evelyn. She returned to the clinic, her clothes torn and her hands trembling, to find Elias still writing, his expression unchanged. Ruth, sitting beside him, looked at Evelyn with something like pity. "I told you," she said softly. "You can't stop it." The town, already on edge, erupted when news of Mary's death spread. Henry Tate, devastated by his wife's loss, led a new mob to the clinic, their shouts echoing through the dawn. "Give us the boy!" they demanded, their faces twisted with grief and rage. Sheriff Reed, now questioning his own judgment, barely held them back, his shotgun raised in warning. Evelyn, reeling from the night's events, turned to Elias's notebook for answers. The spiral symbol, now a constant presence, seemed to taunt her. She noticed something new. Faint lines connecting the spirals to the names, forming a pattern that resembled a constellation. She sketched it out, her hands shaking, and sent a copy to her astronomer friend in St. Louis, begging for insight. His reply, received days later, was chilling. The pattern matched no known constellation but resembled ancient astrological charts used to predict calamities. "It's almost as if he's charting fate itself," the letter read. Evelyn's sessions with Elias grew more intense. She tried to disrupt his writing, giving him blank paper, then no paper at all, but he found ways to continue, scratching symbols into the wooden table, even using his own blood when a pencil broke. His behavior grew more erratic, his rocking more violent, as if something inside him were fighting to break free. Evelyn began to wonder if Elias was not just predicting deaths but channeling something that used him as a conduit. The thought was unscientific, terrifying, but it gnawed at her, fueled by the growing body count. The 7th name appeared that night. Eleanor Reed. House. Evening. Poisoned. Eleanor was the sheriff's elderly mother, a frail woman who rarely left her home. Evelyn, now frantic, warned Amos, who dismissed the prediction as nonsense. "Ain't no poison in my house," he growled, but his eyes betrayed his fear. As the town's anger simmered, threatening to boil over, Evelyn realized that saving Eleanor might be her last chance to prove Elias wasn't a monster, or to uncover what was. But the spiral in Elias's notebook grew larger, its lines darker, as if signaling that the worst was yet to come. The Missouri Ozarks, cloaked in the gloom of late November 1957, seemed to tighten their grip on Black Hollow, as if the hills themselves were complicit in the town's unraveling. The air was heavy with the scent of impending snow, and the streets, once alive with the hum of daily life, now echoed with the footsteps of a community fractured by fear. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her mind fraying under the weight of 5 failed interventions, sat in the dim clinic, her eyes fixed on Elias Carver. The boy, silent as ever, rocked gently in his chair, his pencil carving the jagged spiral that had become the town's unspoken emblem of dread. The 6th death, Mary Tate's fall in the forest, had pushed Black Hollow past its breaking point, and the 7th name in Elias's notebook, Eleanor Reed House, Evening, Poisoned, hung over the town like a guillotine. Eleanor Reed, Sheriff Amos Reed's mother, was a frail woman of 72, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering faith. She lived in a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by jars of homemade preserves and faded photographs of better days. Amos, shaken by the mob's growing hostility and Mary Tate's death, refused to believe his mother was in danger. "Ain't no poison in my house," he told Evelyn, his voice gruff but unsteady. The boy's wrong this time. Yet the memory of 5 precise predictions gnawed at him, and he agreed to let Evelyn monitor Eleanor, though he insisted on staying close. "I trust my own eyes over that kid's scribbles," he said, clutching his revolver as if it could protect him from fate. Evelyn, desperate to break the cycle, devised a meticulous plan. She and Amos searched Eleanor's house, inspecting every cupboard, jar, and teacup for anything that could be construed as poison. They found nothing. No chemicals, no spoiled food, not even a stray pill. Eleanor, annoyed by the intrusion, hated away their concerns with a huff. "I'm no child to be coddled," she snapped, shooing them from her kitchen. But Evelyn's persistence won out, and Eleanor agreed to eat only food prepared by Amos that evening under Evelyn's supervision. "If it'll quiet you down, fine," she grumbled, her hands trembling as she poured her tea. As evening approached, the clinic felt like a pressure cooker. Elias, confined to a cot in the corner, continued his relentless writing, the spiral symbol now dominating his pages. His eyes, unblinking and distant, seemed to follow something invisible, and Evelyn noticed his rocking had intensified, his body swaying like a metronome. She tried to engage him, holding up a blank sheet of paper and asking him to draw something else, anything else. But Elias pushed it away, his pencil returning to the spiral as if compelled by a force beyond his control. Ruth, his mother, sat nearby, her face a mask of resignation. "He don't stop," she whispered. "Not till it's done." At 6:30 p.m., Evelyn and Amos escorted Eleanor to the clinic for dinner, a precaution Evelyn insisted upon to ensure no outside interference. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, and apples, all inspected by Evelyn herself. Eleanor ate sparingly, her eyes darting to Elias, who sat across the room, writing. "That boy's trouble," she muttered, her voice low. "Always knew it." Amos shushed her, but his own unease was palpable, his hand resting on his gun. The clock ticked towards 7 p.m., the time Elias had written. Nothing happened. Evelyn allowed herself a flicker of hope. Perhaps the prediction would fail, perhaps the cycle could be broken. Then, at 7:03, Eleanor gasped, her teacup clattering to the floor. Her face turned ashen, her hands clawing at her throat. "My chest," she wheezed, collapsing. Evelyn rushed to her side, shouting for the town's doctor, who was already on call nearby. Amos stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror, as the doctor administered emergency measures. But it was too late. Eleanor's heart stopped at 7:06, her body limp on the clinic floor. The doctor, his face grim, later confirmed poisoning, likely from a fast-acting toxin ingested hours earlier. But how? Every morsel had been checked, every sip scrutinized. The town exploded. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the clinic, their shouts now a unified demand for Elias's removal. Henry Tate, still grieving Mary, led the charge, his voice hoarse with rage. "He's killing us all," he screamed, brandishing a pitchfork. Sheriff Reed, devastated by his mother's death, could no longer hold them back. He allowed Evelyn to take Elias to a locked room in the town hall, a temporary measure to protect him. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Amos admitted, his voice breaking. "But I can't let them tear him apart." Evelyn, now on the brink of collapse, returned to Elias's notebook, searching for answers. The spiral symbol, now sprawling across entire pages, seemed to mock her efforts. She noticed a new detail: faint numbers embedded within the spiral's lines corresponding to the dates of each death. She cross-checked them against a calendar. Each matched perfectly. But there was something else. A second set of numbers, smaller and hidden, that didn't align with the known deaths. Were they future predictions, or something else entirely? She sent another letter to her astronomer friend, enclosing a copy of the spiral, but she doubted he'd have answers in time. Elias's behavior grew more alarming. He began to hum, a low, eerie sound that was the first vocalization anyone had heard from him. The hum matched no recognizable tune, yet it sent chills down Evelyn's spine, as if it carried the weight of something ancient. Ruth, hearing it, crossed herself, whispering, "He's talking to it." When Evelyn pressed her for an explanation, Ruth only shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You wouldn't believe me," she said. "I don't even believe it myself." The seventh death shattered what remained of Black Hollow's resolve. The mob grew larger, their demands more violent. Evelyn realized that Elias's predictions were no longer just a mystery. They were a catalyst, turning neighbor against neighbor, faith against reason. The eighth name appeared that night: Daniel Holt. Bridge, dawn, shot. Daniel, Reverend Holt's teenage son, was a quiet boy who'd stayed out of the town's chaos. Evelyn, now certain that Elias's predictions were unstoppable, faced a chilling question. Was the boy merely a witness to fate, or was he its architect? The answer lay in the spiral, and she was running out of time to find it. The dawn of December 1st, 1957, broke over Black Hollow with a sky bruised purple, the kind of morning that seemed to warn of calamity. The town, already fractured by 6 deaths, each foretold by Elias Carver's relentless pencil, teetered on the edge of anarchy. The air was sharp with the promise of snow, and the streets were alive with the low murmur of a mob that had grown bolder with each tragedy. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her hands trembling from exhaustion and dread, stood guard in the locked room of the town hall where Elias now stayed, his notebook a growing testament to the terror gripping the Missouri Ozarks. The eighth name, scrawled in his meticulous script, was Daniel Holt. Bridge, dawn, shot. Daniel, the 16-year-old son of Reverend Holt, was a lanky boy known for his quiet piety, a stark contrast to his father's fiery sermons. The prediction sent a fresh wave of horror through Black Hollow, and Evelyn knew this death, if it came to pass, would ignite the town's rage beyond control. Reverend Holt, whose calls for Elias's banishment had fueled the mob, was shaken by the prediction. "My boy ain't part of this," he insisted, his voice cracking as he confronted Evelyn in the town hall. "Your science can't explain this evil." Evelyn, her patience worn thin, urged him to keep Daniel safe, suggesting they lock him in the church until dawn passed. Holt, torn between his faith and his fear, agreed, but his eyes burned with a mix of grief and accusation. "If my son dies, it's on you and that boy," he spat, storming off to collect Daniel. Evelyn, haunted by her failure to save Eleanor Reed, resolved to protect Daniel at all costs, even as her belief in a rational explanation frayed further. The Black Hollow Bridge, A rickety wooden structure spanning the swollen river was the predicted site of Daniel's death. Evelyn and Sheriff Amos Reed, now a shadow of his former authority, set up a perimeter around it, posting deputies to guard both ends. Daniel, pale and trembling, was kept in the church under his father's watchful eye, the doors barred and windows shuttered. Evelyn stayed with Elias, whose behavior had grown increasingly erratic. His humming, that eerie, tuneless sound, filled the room, rising and falling like a distant storm. His pencil moved faster now, the spiral symbol sprawling across the page, its jagged lines interwoven with numbers that seemed to pulse with intent. Evelyn noticed a new detail. The numbers hidden within the spiral were increasing, forming a sequence that suggested more deaths beyond the 13 Elias had predicted. The realization chilled her. Was this nightmare only beginning? As dawn approached, the town held its breath. The mob, led by Henry Tate, gathered near the bridge, their shouts muted by the weight of the moment. Evelyn, stationed at the town hall, checked her watch obsessively. 5:45 a.m. The sky lightened, casting a gray glow over the river. Then, a gunshot shattered the silence, echoing across the valley. Evelyn's heart sank as she raced toward the bridge, her boots slipping on the frosted ground. The deputies, confused and shouting, pointed to the riverbank where Daniel Holt lay sprawled, a bullet wound in his chest. Reverend Holt, arriving moments later, fell to his knees, his wail cutting through the morning mist. The shooter, a young deputy named Caleb, swore it was an accident. His rifle had discharged while he was adjusting it, the bullet ricocheting off a metal post. But the timing, the precision, matched Elias's prediction to the second. The mob erupted, their grief and fear coalescing into a singular demand: Elias's destruction. "He's a curse!" Henry Tate roared, his pitchfork raised like a banner. Sheriff Reed, his face ashen from his mother's death, and now this, could barely restrain them. Reverend Holt, clutching Daniel's body, turned his fury on Evelyn. "You brought this on us," he screamed, his faith shattered. "You and your godless science." Evelyn, reeling, returned to Elias, who sat unmoved, his pencil tracing the spiral as if nothing had happened. Ruth, his mother, sat in the corner, her eyes vacant. "He didn't mean it," she whispered, but her words lacked conviction. Evelyn's desperation reached a breaking point. She seized Elias's notebook, flipping through pages that now seemed alive with menace. The spiral, larger than ever, was no longer just a symbol. It felt like a presence, a force that linked each death in a pattern she couldn't yet grasp. She noticed a new element: faint sketches of faces, barely discernible, embedded within the spiral's lines. One resembled Margaret Hale, another Thomas Granger. Was Elias drawing his victims, or were they being drawn through him? She confronted him, holding up the notebook. "What are you seeing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Elias's eyes met hers for the first time, and in their gray depths she saw not a boy, but something ancient, something that knew her fears. That night, the 9th name appeared: Abigail Morrow. Lake. Noon. Drowned. Abigail, a young widow who ran the town's general store, was known for her kindness and her refusal to believe Elias was dangerous. Evelyn, now haunted by the faces in the spiral, began to suspect that Elias's predictions weren't random. They were connected, not just by time and place, but by the people themselves. She mapped the victims' lives, searching for a link. Margaret had taught Sunday school with Clara Boone. Thomas Granger had argued with Jacob Wells over land. Eleanor Reed had bought fish from Samuel Klein. The connections were subtle, but they formed a web, with Elias at its center. As the mob's threats grew louder, Evelyn realized that protecting Abigail might be her last chance to understand Elias's mind, or to stop him. But the spiral's growing complexity, the humming that now filled the town hall, and the faces in the notebook suggested a truth far darker than she'd imagined. Was Elias a conduit for something beyond human understanding, or was he weaving the town's fate with his own hands? The answer lay in the next death, and Evelyn feared it would break her before it broke the town. The first snowflakes of December 1957 dusted Black Hollow, settling on the rooftops like a false promise of peace. The town, now a hollow shell of its former self, buzzed with a restless dread that seemed to seep from the very earth. 7 deaths: Margaret Hale, Thomas Granger, Clara Boone, Jacob Wells, Samuel Klein, Mary Tate, and Daniel Holt, had left scars on every heart. each one foretold by Elias Carver's silent, unyielding pencil. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her mind teetering on the edge of obsession, felt the weight of those deaths as she guarded the boy in the town hall's locked room. His notebook, now a tome of terror, bore the 8th name: Abigail Morrow. Lake, noon, drowned. Abigail, the gentle widow who ran Black Hollow's general store, was the town's last beacon of kindness. Her warm smile a fading memory in a community consumed by fear. Evelyn, haunted by the faces she'd seen in Elias's spiraling symbols, knew this death could unravel the final threads of her sanity, or reveal the truth she'd been chasing. Abigail, unlike the others, believed in Elias's innocence. "He's just a boy," she'd said to Evelyn days earlier, her voice soft but firm as she handed out free coffee to the shivering mob. "He's not the monster here." Her faith made Evelyn's mission to save her all the more urgent. Determined to break the cycle, Evelyn devised a plan to keep Abigail far from the lake, a murky, reed-choked body of water on the town's outskirts, known for its treacherous currents. She convinced Abigail to stay in the town hall with Elias under the pretext of helping with supplies. Sheriff Amos Reed, his authority eroded by grief and doubt, assigned 2 deputies to patrol the lake, ensuring no one approached. "This ends today," he told Evelyn, his voice hollow. "It has to." Inside the town hall, the air was thick with tension. Elias, now barely eating, rocked back and forth, his humming louder, more insistent, like a chant from some forgotten ritual. The spiral symbol, now a sprawling labyrinth across his pages, seemed to writhe under Evelyn's gaze, its lines interwoven with faces: Margaret, Thomas, Clara, and the others, their eyes rendered in faint, ghostly strokes. Evelyn, poring over the notebook, noticed a new pattern. The numbers hidden within the spiral corresponded not just to dates but to locations, as if mapping a grid across Black Hollow. The lake, she realized, was a focal point, its coordinates repeated in every prediction. Was it a coincidence, or was the lake itself part of the mystery? As noon approached, Evelyn kept Abigail busy sorting blankets and talking about mundane things to distract her. Abigail, though nervous, complied, her hands trembling as she folded linens. Elias, sitting nearby, suddenly stopped writing, his pencil hovering over the page. His eyes, those unsettling gray pools, locked onto Abigail, and for the first time, he reached out, touching her hand. Abigail froze, her breath catching as Elias's fingers lingered, cold and trembling. "He's never done that," Ruth whispered from the corner, her voice laced with fear. Evelyn, alarmed, pulled Abigail away, but the moment left a chill in the room, as if Elias had marked her in some intangible way. At 11:50 a.m., a commotion outside broke the silence. A deputy burst in, his face pale. "The lake, it's overflowing!" he shouted. Heavy rains from the previous week had swollen the river, and the lake's banks had breached, flooding the fields near the town hall. Evelyn's heart sank. Abigail was supposed to be safe here, far from the water. But as she turned to check on her, Abigail was gone. The back door, left ajar by the deputy's haste, swung in the wind. Evelyn and the deputy raced outside, shouting Abigail's name, their boots sinking into the muddy ground. The floodwater, dark and churning, had reached the town hall steps, an unnatural surge that seemed to defy the gentle slope of the land. They found Abigail at the lake's edge, her skirt soaked, her eyes dazed as she waded into the water. "I have to go," she murmured, her voice dreamlike, as if drawn by an unseen force. Evelyn grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but the current was stronger, tugging at Abigail's legs. The deputy waded in to help, but a sudden wave, impossible in such a shallow lake, swept Abigail under. Evelyn screamed, diving after her, but the water was murky, swallowing Abigail's form. When they finally pulled her out, her body was limp, her lungs filled with water. The time was 12:02 p.m. The lake had claimed her exactly as Elias had written. The town's reaction was swift and brutal. The mob, now a force of its own, stormed the town hall, their shouts a cacophony of rage and despair. "Burn the boy!" someone yelled, and others took up the cry. Sheriff Reed, his face etched with defeat, barred the door, but his deputies were wavering, some joining the crowd. Evelyn, soaked and shivering, confronted Elias, who had resumed writing, the spiral now covering an entire wall he'd scratched into with a nail. "Why her?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Elias didn't look up, but his humming grew louder, almost a wail, as if he were mourning or summoning. Evelyn's research took a darker turn. She found a local legend buried in the town's archives about the lake, a place once used for rituals by a forgotten Ozark cult, who believed it was a gateway to the other side. The spirals in Elias's notebook matched symbols described in the records, said to channel visions of death. Was Elias tapping into something ancient, something tied to the land itself? She sent another letter to her astronomer friend, including the lake's coordinates and the spiral's latest iteration, but she feared the answer would come too late. That night, the 9th name appeared: Joseph Crane, barn, midnight, crushed. Joseph, a blacksmith known for his strength, was one of the mob's leaders, a man who'd called for Elias's death. Evelyn, now seeing the web of connections between the victims, each linked by shared histories, grudges, or kindnesses, wondered if the spiral was selecting them deliberately. The lake's flood, the faces in the symbols, and Elias's touch on Abigail's hand suggested a pattern not just of prediction, but of purpose. As the mob's torches lit the night, Evelyn faced a chilling truth. Saving Joseph might be impossible, but understanding Elias could mean confronting a force older than Black Hollow itself. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing Black Hollow in a deceptive calm that masked the chaos simmering beneath. By December 2, 1957, the town was a powder keg, its people bound by a shared terror that had claimed 8 lives. Margaret Hale, Thomas Granger, Clara Boone, Jacob Wells, Samuel Klein, Mary Tate, Daniel Holt, and Abigail Morrow, all foretold by the mute 12-year-old Elias Carver. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her mind a tangle of fear and fixation, stood in the town hall's locked room surrounded by walls scarred with Elias's spirals. The boy, his thin frame hunched over a splintered table, scratched his pencil with a feverish intensity, the jagged symbol sprawling like a living thing. The 9th name in his notebook, Joseph Crane, barn, midnight, crushed, loomed over the town, a promise of death that felt like the final straw. Joseph, a burly blacksmith and a leader of the mob baying for Elias's blood, was a man whose strength had made him a symbol of resistance. If he fell, Evelyn knew Black Hollow would burn. The mob's torches cast flickering shadows through the town hall's windows, their chants a relentless drumbeat. End the curse. And the boy. Sheriff Amos Reed, his face hollowed by grief and doubt, stood guard at the door, his shotgun trembling in his hands. I can't hold him much longer, he warned Evelyn, his voice raw. Ruth Carver, Elias's mother, sat in the corner, her eyes fixed on her son, torn between love and a growing certainty that he was no longer entirely hers. Evelyn, clinging to the last threads of her scientific resolve, had spent the day digging deeper into the town's history, piecing together fragments of the Ozark cult legend she'd uncovered. The lake, the spirals, the deaths, all pointed to something ancient, something tied to the land itself. The cult, active a century ago, had believed the lake was a portal, and their rituals, marked by spirals, were said to summon visions of fate. Elias's symbols matched their descriptions perfectly, down to the numbers woven into the lines, which Evelyn now suspected were not random but deliberate, a code she was desperate to crack. Joseph Crane, defiant to the end, refused to hide. I ain't scared of a kid's scribbles, he bellowed at a town meeting, his hammer-like fists clenched. But his bravado faltered when Evelyn showed him the notebook, the spiral beside his name pulsing with an almost palpable menace. She begged him to stay away from his barn, to lock himself in the church with Reverend Holt, who, since Daniel's death, had retreated into a haunted silence. Joseph agreed reluctantly to spend the night in the town hall under Evelyn's watch, but his eyes betrayed his fear. A man who'd faced down bears now trembled at a boy's pencil. As midnight neared, the town hall was a fortress under siege. The mob, now swollen with newcomers from neighboring towns drawn by the gruesome rumors, pounded on the doors, their shouts punctuated by the crack of breaking glass. Evelyn, Joseph, and Amos barricaded the entrance, while Elias continued writing, his humming now a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate the walls. Evelyn noticed a change in his notebook. The spiral was no longer alone. It was surrounded by smaller spirals, each containing a faint sketch of a face. 9 faces now, including Abigail's, their eyes rendered with an eerie precision that made Evelyn's skin crawl. The numbers within the main spiral had multiplied, forming a sequence that, when decoded, pointed to the barn's exact location. Evelyn's astronomer friend had sent a reply that morning, confirming the spiral's resemblance to ancient astrological charts. But with a twist, they aligned with no known stars, only with points of convergence he couldn't explain. It's as if he's mapping something beyond the sky, the letter read. At 11:50 p.m., Joseph grew restless, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I can't stay here," he muttered, his voice thick with panic. "I need air." Before Evelyn could stop him, he shoved past Amos and flung open the back door, bolting into the snowy night. Evelyn and Amos chased after him, their shouts lost in the wind as the mob's roar grew louder. They followed Joseph's tracks to his barn, a looming structure on the town's edge, its beams creaking under the weight of fresh snow. Inside, Joseph stood frozen, staring at a pile of iron tools stacked precariously against the wall. "I didn't leave him like that," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold. At exactly midnight, a low rumble shook the barn and the stack collapsed, crushing Joseph beneath a cascade of metal. His scream was brief, silenced by the weight that pinned him to the floor. When Evelyn and Amos pulled the debris away, his body was broken, his eyes wide with the terror that seemed to linger in the air. The mob, witnessing the aftermath, fell silent for the first time in days, their torches flickering in the snow, but the silence was fleeting. "The boy did this," Henry Tate screamed, reigniting the crowd's fury. They surged toward the town hall, intent on reaching Elias. Evelyn, her mind reeling, returned to find him still writing, the 10th name now visible. Ruth Carver. Cabin, dawn, strangled. Ruth, sitting beside her son, saw the name and let out a choked sob, her hands clutching her throat as if feeling the noose already. Evelyn, horrified, realized the spiral was closing in, targeting the one person closest to Elias. The faces in the notebook, now 10 including Joseph's, seemed to watch her, their sketched eyes accusing, pleading, or perhaps warning. Evelyn's research took a frantic turn. She found a final piece of the cult's history, a ritual that required a vessel, a person with a unique mind to channel the visions. The cult believed the vessel could not only see death but influence it, binding the fates of others to the spiral. Was Elias the vessel, chosen by some ancient force tied to the lake? Or was he something else? A boy whose mind, amplified by autism, had stumbled into a power no one could control. The spiral's numbers now pointed to the cabin, and Evelyn suspected the final deaths would converge there where it all began. As the mob's torches closed in, and Ruth's name burned in the notebook, Evelyn faced an impossible choice: protect Elias, or stop him before the spiral claimed its final victims. The snow fell in thick curtains over Black Hollow on December 3, 1957. As if the Missouri Ozarks were trying to bury the town's sins under a frozen veil. 9 lives had been claimed: Margaret Hale, Thomas Granger, Clara Boone, Jacob Wells, Samuel Klein, Mary Tate, Daniel Holt, Abigail Morrow, and Joseph Crane, each death a chilling fulfillment of Elias Carver's predictions, etched in his sprawling spiral symbols. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, her mind a battlefield of doubt and dread, stood in the town hall's locked room, where Elias, the mute 12-year-old, sat hunched over his notebook. His pencil, now worn to a nub, scratched relentlessly, the 10th name glaring from the page: Ruth Carver. Cabin, dawn, strangled. Ruth, Elias's mother, sat trembling nearby, her eyes fixed on her son, love and terror warring in her heart. The mob outside, their torches a constellation of rage in the snow, chanted for Elias's end, their voices a relentless tide threatening to break through Sheriff Amos Reed's faltering defenses. Evelyn knew this was the final act. Either she would unravel the spiral's truth, or Black Hollow would fall to its own darkness. The 10th prediction, targeting Ruth, felt like the spiral's cruelest twist. Evelyn, her hands shaking from exhaustion, pieced together the final fragments of her research. The Ozark cult's record spoke of a vessel, who could channel death's visions but also of a ritual's end. A final sacrifice to seal the spiral's power or break it. Was Ruth the key, or was Elias himself the sacrifice? The notebook's faces, 10 now, each victim rendered in ghostly lines, seemed to watch her, their eyes a silent plea. The numbers woven into the spiral pointed to the Carver cabin, where it all began, and Evelyn suspected the final deaths would converge there, in the heart of the town's nightmare. Determined to save Ruth and end the cycle, Evelyn convinced Sheriff Reed to move Elias and Ruth to the cabin, away from the mob's reach. "If we can stop this one, we stop it all," she told Amos, her voice steady despite her fear. The sheriff, broken by his mother's death and the town's collapse, agreed, but his eyes were hollow, his gun a constant weight in his hand. They slipped out the town hall's back door under cover of darkness, the mob's shouts echoing behind them. The cabin, a ramshackle structure on the town's edge, stood silent in the snow, its windows dark like empty eyes. Inside, Ruth lit a lantern, its flickering light casting shadows that seemed to mimic Elias's spirals. Evelyn searched the cabin for clues, finding scraps of Elias's earliest drawings, spirals from years before, drawn when he was barely 6. They were simpler then, but the same jagged shape persisted as if it had grown with him. Ruth, her voice barely audible, confessed a secret she'd buried. When Elias was born, she'd taken him to the lake, desperate for a blessing from the old Ozark tales her grandmother told. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I thought it was just a story." Had that act, that moment at the lake, awakened something in Elias? Evelyn's astronomer friend's final letter arrived that night. Smuggled by a deputy, the spiral's numbers aligned with no celestial pattern, but with ley lines, ancient paths of energy said to crisscross the earth, converging at Black Hollow's lake. The cult had believed these lines carried the voices of the dead. As dawn approached, Elias's humming grew frantic, a keening wail that seemed to shake the cabin's walls. His pencil stopped, and he began to rock violently, his eyes fixed on Ruth. The 10th name was joined by an 11th, Amos Reed. Cabin, dawn, shot. Evelyn's heart raced. 2 predictions for the same time and place. She checked her watch. 5:30 a.m. The mob, having tracked them, surrounded the cabin, their torches a ring of fire in the snow. Amos, stationed at the door, gripped his gun, his face pale. "Stay back," he shouted, but the mob pressed closer, led by Henry Tate, whose grief had turned to madness. Evelyn, desperate, tried to disrupt Elias's trance, shaking him and shouting his name. For the first time, he spoke a single word: "Stop," in a voice that was not a boy's but something deeper, older. Ruth screamed, backing away, her hands clutching her throat. At 5:55 a.m., a gunshot rang out, not from the mob, but from Amos's revolver. He staggered, blood blooming on his chest, his own weapon turned against him in a moment of confusion. He fell dead as the clock struck dawn. The mob, hearing the shot, surged forward, breaking the door. Henry Tate, wild-eyed, grabbed Ruth, his hands tightening around her throat. Evelyn lunged, but the mob held her back, their shouts drowning her pleas. Ruth's eyes met Elias's as she struggled, her breath fading. Elias, still rocking, dropped his pencil and the humming stopped. In that moment, the spiral on the wall seemed to pulse, its lines glowing faintly in the lantern's light. Ruth went limp, strangled just as the prediction foretold. But as the mob turned to Elias, something shifted. The boy stood, his eyes clear, and raised his hands. The mob froze, their torches dimming as if the air itself had thickened. Elias walked to the wall, touched the spiral, and it crumbled, the plaster falling away like ash. The mob dispersed, their rage replaced by a stunned silence, as if released from a spell. Evelyn, trembling, realized the spiral was gone from Elias's notebook, replaced by a single word: done. The death stopped. Elias, now silent again, was taken to an asylum in St. Louis where he never wrote another spiral. Black Hollow buried its dead, but the town never recovered, its people haunted by the question of what Elias had been: prophet, vessel, or something else entirely. Evelyn, her career ruined, published a single paper on the case, calling it the Black Hollow Anomaly. She never returned to the Ozarks, but the spiral haunted her dreams, a reminder of the truth she'd glimpsed. Some forces defy explanation, and some minds see too much. Congratulations, brave truth seekers, for reaching the end of this chilling tale. You've walked through the shadows of Black Hollow, daring to face the inexplicable. In the comments, share the phrase, "This story changed my way of seeing the human mind," to join the ranks of those who've uncovered this dark secret. Your voice strengthens our community of seekers, bound by a hunger for the hidden truths no one else dares to tell. Share this video. Let it ripple like the lake's dark waters, so others may know what lies beneath the surface of the human psyche. Subscribe and keep your curiosity alive, for the next story awaits, ready to pull you deeper into the enigma of the unknown.